That's your book there, right, Mark?
All right, Jim, I ate into some of your time, and I do apologize for that. I would like to introduce our next guest speaker this afternoon. I think, as John Carroll said this morning, certainly our next speaker is no stranger to this body. Jim is an adopted son of St. Genevieve and was the former site administrator for the Felix Valley House State Historic Site from 1983 to 2011. Hard to believe it's been 2011, right? In addition to the Valley House, Jim administered activities at the Shaw House, the Amaro House, the Creole House, and the Kern de la Sioux property. Jim is a past recipient of the Foundation for Restoration's Distinguished Service Award. He's a frequent past presenter at this conference and is a frequent contributor at history-related events in general in St. Genevieve. Jim has been a member of the St. Genevieve Speakers Bureau and the State Historical Society of Missouri Speakers Bureau. He's given many presentations both here in St. Genevieve and the surrounding area. He has made cameo appearances in the movie Under These Same Stars. If you saw that, you know that he played an intoxicated English soldier. And the History Channel's program, How the States Got Their Shapes. Please help me welcome Mr. Jim Baker, who will present Set in Stone Historic Masonry in St. Genevieve.
Oh, thank you very much, Sandra. It's always a pleasure to be back in St. Genevieve and see so many friendly, familiar faces. And thanks to Bob for organizing this part of the conference. It's always a treat to be here. So, St. Genevieve, you all know it, you all love it. We're in a tough position in this town because there are so many wonderful historical resources. There are buildings, there are documents, there are folk tales. There's so much here that sometimes we just don't know which direction to turn. But I spent a lot of my days years ago at a beautiful stone building on 2nd and Merchant Street, the Felix Valley House, and I think that's where I kind of fell in love with stone buildings. So in St. Genevieve history, we really are focused on those vertical logs, and rightly so. But today, I wanted to set the balance in motion just a little bit and let you know how many wonderful stone buildings and resources that are here in St. Genevieve that a lot of us drive past every day without really recognizing the importance of those buildings and the stories that they tell us about their owners, and also how it fits into the fabric of the whole history of St. Genevieve. Carl, of course, for him, the world comes to a crashing end in 1804. For me, it's kind of just getting in motion about 1804, so we make a good team. So this illustration is of one of the very important buildings that a lot of you would not recognize because it's not standing anymore today, but we're going to get into that in just a little bit. So, for any of you who have studied historic towns and villages, one of the truly remarkable resources that are out there to help understand towns and their progression are the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. St. Genevieve is really lucky in that we have 4 editions of those maps to deal with, in 1894, 1901, 1911, and 1929. And you actually can look at those maps as they move along in time and see the progression of new buildings being added, but also the loss of some of the historic buildings at the time. So we're going to focus our attention today mostly on 1894's map. This is a conjoined map of the historic area, and you recognize Merchant Street, Market, the area around the church, Main Street, 2nd. Those are all pretty familiar sites. So the insurance maps are remarkably accurate and detailed to the point that they not only tell you the fabric of the building, They tell you how many stories. They tell you what the roof's made of. These are all things that fire insurance people were very interested in 1894. But it's also things that we're interested in terms of historic approaches today. So we're going to focus on that third line down, the buildings that are set in blue, color-coded, and those are stone buildings. Oops. I've taken the map, and it may be a little harder to see in bigger version, but the areas that are slightly darker are areas of stone buildings that we're going to kind of focus on today. Not all the stone buildings in St. Genevieve, in the town today, are on this map. So we're going to go a little bit outside of the map too, but we're going to start right here in the historic district. And, okay, Bob.
Trying to get a picture of you waving your arm.
There'll be plenty of opportunities. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the Jean-Baptiste Berto house, a beautiful stone structure. It's on the corner of Jefferson and 4th Street, 2-story building. And some of the detail things I'd like you to look at a little closer are the jack arches with the keystone above the windows, beautifully executed. The projecting fireplace at the end facade of the house, those are all elements of the kind of construction of this building. Beautiful projecting eaves over the building. It's in great shape. As we go along, I've noticed some changes in the masonry, and in a wooden building, it's sometimes a little easier to disguise a change in a structure. In a stone building, it's much harder. The door arrangement on the front facade, the side that faces Jefferson, has changed over time. If we can do the next slide. You see a beautiful historic shot of the building there on the left from the Habs collection, but the lower picture is a current picture. I've kind of made some highlights in there from my reading of the building, and you see lines in masonry that follow down underneath those windows. That to me indicates that those were actually at one point doors instead of windows. So now that puts this building with the 2 entrances into a different class of structure. The Felix Valley House fits into that class as well. It was buildings that I believe had multi-purpose use intended, both as a residence and as a commercial building. So that's why the 2 entrances are important. There are a number of frame buildings in St. Genevieve that use that same technique to incorporate 2 things in one building. But this is a beautiful example in stone. Okay. Another building that's sadly gone is the big Pratt warehouse complex. This was on 4th Street and Merchant Street on the corner. So as you came out of the front porch of the Gibor Valley House last night, you would have faced right out to these stone buildings. The bigger one on the corner is connected to a smaller, I believe maybe an older structure just to the left in the photograph by that beautiful arched gate. Joseph Pratt, who owned a majority of that block in the late 1700s and early 1800s, was certainly in several different kind of business pursuits, trading being one of them. And the folklore along with it is that these were his warehouse buildings as part of his business operation. Okay, we can do the next one, Bob, please. Another shot from a different side, and you see the gate there. These buildings were dismantled in the 1960s, so they've been gone about 50 years or so. That's the bad news. The good news is they're recorded here in some detail. Another bit of good news is that Matt Ziegler, who was an artist here in St. Genevieve, a local artist of somewhat larger audience, actually was kind of a Renaissance guy. He rescued the stone from the Pratt warehouse and used it to build the art gallery that's got his name behind the Shaw House today. So the stone survives. In describing that to tourists, I say, well, you know, the stone is not old, but actually that's a misnomer. All the stone is old. It's just been reused from a prior building. So a little bit of that Pratt warehouse still survives today, but truly a commercial structure, completely a commercial structure to start. Eventually it became a school as part of the Valley Schools complex. Another marvelous 2-story stone building is right up on the square. Of course, you see the Catholic Church just behind it. Father Weiss came here to St. Genevieve and had big ambitions for the community. He arranged for the construction of this two-story stone building in the early 1870s with the hope that he would lure the Christian brothers here as a teaching order. And he tried to make that case to them, but unfortunately they did not agree to do that. So he had a magnificent stone building on his hands, which he then turned into the rectory for the parish. So it still got good use. You can see on the Sanborn map section there, it's a two-story stone building, and it's, of course, right next to the brick Catholic Church today. Next slide. But, of course, it wasn't always quite that way. In the upper photograph, where you see the stone church that was built about beginning in 1831, just on the left-hand edge of that photograph, you can see the two-story stone Christian Brothers School. This dates that photograph to a pretty narrow period of time. The building, we think, was completed about 1873. The brick church, the construction for that began in 1876. So it really gets a narrowed down time period for when those two stone buildings were next to each other and cohabitated. Another beautiful shot of the rectory building. In the lower photograph, you can see that the front entrance is a door that's closed today, and it had dual stairs going down either side. So it's pretty substantial, beautiful building. It's a little later than some of the earlier stone buildings in town, has a few stylistic changes, but still it uses the local, beautiful limestone that we have so much of in St. Genevieve County. Okay. Here's that stone church. And my goodness, what would we give to see that building in its all glory today? The front facade, from looking at the picture, looks to me as though those stones were faced. And we'll use a couple terms like that today in looking at these images. When a mason gives a stone a face, it's cut into a rough block, and that's ashlar stone. But then instead of the facing edge on the building being natural, it's treated, and they use masonry tools to clean up that edge so it's really very, very flat. So when all those stones are put together, the surface of the building is very flat and very finished. You can see that treatment on the front projecting facade of the building. The sides are field dress stones. They're hewn roughly into blocks, but the face of the block is still fairly rough. So that's a marvelous building, and we think, oh, too bad it's gone. But it's not all gone. When we were doing the research for the diorama that's in the Amaro house, Bill Miller and I got permission from the church. We crawled in the crawl space under the Catholic Church. And the entrance is right here. And lo and behold, the foundation and first few courses of stonework of the stone church are still right in place. So I went and put my hand on them. It's an amazing, amazing building, and the stone under there obviously hasn't seen any kind of weather in the last few years. It's in beautiful condition. I have to digress and tell you one tale. So we wanted to know exactly how big that stone building was to recreate it in the diorama. So I held the dummy end of the tape measure, which is, the loose end, and crawled down the crawl space along the edge of that building to get to the end of it, to measure it. And as I'm crawling down, I look up ahead and I can see two beady little lit eyes kind of looking back at me, and I realized that I probably was in kind of an untenable position because I couldn't stand up and run. Whatever I had to do, I had to back up. So Mr. Charlie Baziel said later on, oh yes, we've been having terrible trouble with skunks getting into the church. So fortunately, the skunk and I did not have a close encounter. But the central portion of the floor of this brick church, right in through here, is being supported on the foundation and the floor joists of that old stone church. So when you walk down that aisle today, you're really walking down the center part of that stone church from 1831. Okay. Other buildings in town are strictly for a specific use. And this is that great little ice house that's in the middle of that block that's bounded by Market and 3rd and 4th Street. You can see it's mentioned on the Sanborn Fire Insurance map, and it's still there today. On the inside, I don't think you'd recognize it as an ice house because it's part of the bed and breakfast that was there at one point, and I believe it has a hot tub and some things that are a little incongruous for an ice house, but still, it's preserved. The roof has been raised at some time, but the structure of the building is still really fairly much intact. Okay. This is a great little building that everybody in the foundation ought to recognize, now the foundation headquarters. This is on a lot that was originally owned by Francois Vallée II, and many people at times have called this the Francois Vallée II house. And it's really probably an unfortunate mischaracterization of it. This building was built, I think, about 1813 by Henry Kyle, and after Francois's death and his wife's death, the property passed out of their hands. This is a great little commercial building from that first couple decades of the 19th century. And as I looked at it, I was fascinated by this building as well. It's limestone as well, but it's a little different shade of limestone. And what I learned from the guys at the quarry was limestone comes in several different varieties from the same quarry, and you can get from light to dark, tan, brown, other colors. It just depends on the mineral content that's along with the limestone. So a commercial building, and I remember, gosh, what's the name of the guy who donated it? Mr. Schwint told me his father was a mason, and his father was the one who took out two doorways, which we can go to, the two separate entrances, this commercial entrance, and his father took that out. And he was a mason, so he very expertly filled in those two doorways and created a central doorway. And he said, now there are two concrete columns in the basement. He said, don't ever try and cut into those, because his dad propped up that staircase that goes up on the inside of the building, he said, with the frame of a Model T. So in that concrete is a Model T frame that's holding up the stairs now. So, but to me, this was a fascinating picture. This building shows up in the panoramic painting of St. Genevieve from the 1850s as a two-entrance building, and it made it fairly far into the 1900s. This picture's from probably 1936 or 37. Beautifully done in the stonework. These heavily hewn stone blocks, the ashlar blocks, are made up, and they create a very nice sharp corner and a little bit more of a field dress stone on the in-between. But Henry Kyle was an entrepreneur in St. Genevieve at that point. He's listed on a jury list in 1812. His occupation was tobacconist. So not too many tobacconists left in St. Genevieve today, but it could very well be that this was part of his business operation. At one point, it was also known as a printing house. There's a little drawing of it. This is a stone house that most people in St. Genevieve have seen, but they don't realize what they're looking at when they see it. This is the Woods family funeral home today from the 2nd Street side. But does this have a pointer, Bob?
Yeah, it's down, it's upper right.
Oh, right here. Right here's the outline. And I finally asked myself the important question, gee, why is that in this building? Well, it's because that building, really, the center part is this little stone dwelling house. It faced out onto Market Street. It was the home of Dr. Ichabod Sargent. I think the funeral home just grew up around it, and eventually they did this stone work on the new addition, and they carried it right over onto the side of this little stone building. It's kind of an amazing thing. As I've gone into the funeral home on different occasions, if you know what I'm talking about, there's the main front room, but then you go back into another little room, and there strangely are two doorways that go back into that room. When you walk through either one of those two doorways into that next room, you're actually walking into Dr. Sargent's house. Amazing. And we're lucky to have an image of that house. Go ahead. So there it is in a little detail. You recognize that the wall out in front really is in the same place the wall around the parking lot is today at Woods Family Funeral Home. You can see the stone work here, kind of rubble filled, but a nice flat finished lintel piece above the windows. And it looks to me as though this house started out with smaller and they needed to expand and wanted to use the second floor for living space. They raised up the roof line. You see that section there, raised it up to create a more living space on the second floor. Okay. Great little stone building for another purpose. This is behind the Shaw House. Dr. Shaw bought that property in 1837. We think he built the kitchen there in about 1840. So this building had a singular purpose. It was a kitchen structure. You see it on the fire insurance maps right here. Here's the Shaw House. Next slide. The remarkable thing about this great little building is it has two fireplaces, one on the basement level, which is the one that's illustrated right here with the arched fireplace top. The fireplace on the second floor, the main floor where you walk in the door, has a lintel above the fireplace that's just straight across. So a nice little building, intact, beautiful, big, heavy fireplace there on the end. Okay? And if any corner in town, any intersection in town was dedicated to stone buildings, it would be the corner of 2nd and Merchant. This is the great Kyle, Busch, and Roberts storehouse here, built on the corner. This was built about 1818 when they acquired that property. This was a partnership between 3 merchants, Henry Kyle, Albert Busch, and Edmund Roberts. Now you don't hear a French name in that mix. These guys were from out of town. Henry Kyle, as I mentioned, was an entrepreneur who came into St. Genevieve, owned several different buildings and businesses. Albert Busch was of German descent. We'll talk a little more about his business later. Edmund Roberts was from over in Illinois. So these guys built what was, I call it kind of a temple to commerce because of the way the gable end faces the street. And that's something to notice. The gable end of this building faces the street, not the end where the roof comes down, but the gable end is facing the street. This is a truly commercial building. From the inside, it's preserved as well. Beautiful beaded edge paneling on the first floor, which was part of that design at the time for a commercial structure. The same beaded paneling is in the Shaw House, and the same beaded paneling was in the store of the Felix Valley House as well. So they have all those common elements. This is beautiful limestone, which has this facade of a very finely wrought limestone blocks to do the facade of the building. If you go up and look at that building up close, the joints between the 2 blocks where the mortar goes are beautifully even. They're very narrow. They're very finely done. I can tell you this was an expensive building to construct, and it was done by people who had extraordinary talent in masonry. Okay. Now the place that I'm mostly familiar with, the Felix Valley House, but in this case I'm going to refer to it as the Jacob Philipson House because Jacob Philipson was the gentleman who owned the building at first and was responsible for doing the contract of the construction of it. Another beautiful federal style building, another building with a dual purpose, both a residential space and a commercial space. This building was truly meant to be an impressive structure, and I think that's part of the reason why merchants often chose stone for their building material. You've heard that saying, if you want to be successful, you got to look successful. I think a stone masonry building added an air of importance for those merchants, and so they chose that as a primary building material. Here it is back in the 30s. The same thing happened on this building as, remember, the little Henry Kyle stone house. The 2 entrances were closed up and created a central entrance into the house. So those buildings both had a similar fate. This one, though, in the 1970s was restored by the state of Missouri, and the 2 entrance system was replaced. The evidence there was very obvious about where the doors were and how they were laid out, so the restoration just took it back to that original kind of dual entrance construction. Okay. Here's another stone building that we probably drive past every day and don't quite realize what's going on. The building you see there where Bill Nager has his photography shop next to the post office is a building that truly came from the early 1900s, 1901, 1906, somewhere in that range. So it looks to me like that first floor with a heavy stone arch is kind of Richardsonian Romanesque. That doesn't play into St. Genevieve very much. But this little map, this Sanborn map, led me to find a little bit more out about this building. So you can see right here, this blue structure is a stone building. But it's not the same size as this building. So Bill Nager was very kind quite a number of years ago to take me through the building. What I discovered was Albert Busch owned this corner property from about 1828, and he built, after their partnership broke up, he built his own store just down the street. What happened was that building was there. They tore most of it down except one stone wall. They kept the floor joists on the first floor and the second floor, and they built a new, more modern building kind of around that one wall. They've kept one wall. And if you see right in this spot, the two buildings, this is now the Audubons, the two buildings are very close together, but there is a gap big enough to walk in. If you go around behind and get in that gap, you're going to find that there's a beautifully done stone wall. That's part of that Albert Busch store from 1828 that's still in existence. You can see that right here is the second floor of it with the limestone that's field dressed, and then the coins that make up the corner of this finely hewn and dressed stone. Then they added on to the building, made it a little taller, so that's where the brickwork comes in. So this is just the corner of the back. But that whole wall exists in beautifully done limestone. You can see that they filled in here, and this is the little addition that's across the back of the building. So that 1828 building still is in existence, but in partial sense for the stone wall. But if you look inside, the floor joists are beautiful, heavy, commercial-grade floor joists from the 1828 building. There's another section of that beautiful wall. But here's the real clue. So the red in this drawing from 1811 map shows the brick building. But look, they just have a slice right here that says, there's some stone hiding in this building. And that's what's left of Albert Busch's stonework. My architectural drafting skills are not so swift on the computer, but I measured the original building and laid it out on the current building, and the white outline here is what I project would have been the outline of the front facade of that commercial building from Albert Busch. And notice again, the gable end faces the street. Okay. So we're looking at a vertical log building, but instead of that today, my apologies to the Colonial Dames, I want you to look right here. Look at that beautiful 6-foot-tall stone wall. That got brought to my attention by studying some of the court records. Joseph and Bernard Pratt owned the lot next to the Bolducs. They filed suit in 1824 against Sebastian Butcher. They charged him with breaking down their stone wall and carrying away the stone, which seems strange until you realize that Sebastian Butcher, along with his brother Michael, were two of the famous stonemasons from here in St. Genevieve. Michael, in particular, was a guy who had perhaps a little bit of a hot temper. And we won't go into all his escapades, but my suggestion is that they may have been contracted to build the wall for the Pratt brothers. There was some kind of a conflict later on about money or something else, and they took it into their own hands to retrieve some of their cash back. Okay. I just discovered this photograph is from a different angle of a beautiful shot of that great, great stone wall. And look, Martha, where are you? Is Martha here? Yeah, Martha. Recognize these buildings right here. That's the top of half of one of your neighbor's buildings behind that stone wall. In the background, you see the Hoffman's house right there. And I think that little building might be either the Green Tree, I can't get my perspective, or the Little Moses Austin cabin. Okay. And we're back to the Bolduc house, another vertical log, but here I want you to focus right on this little section. So after Louis Bolduc died, they had to partition up that lot, and his widow kept the house. And so they needed to build a kitchen. So the main kitchen, I think, had been maybe something that was on the other side of the lot. So in 1815, they built themselves a brand new kitchen, which was on the porch. They enclosed portion of the porch, a corner, to create a new, more modern kitchen, which is right there. And you see it in this shot from the 1930s. And here is the layout on the floor plan, where they just actually enclosed a corner of the gallery around the house and created a huge fireplace for cooking. So that's another great little stone structure that's been, now it's beautifully preserved. So you can see how that was used and how stone was used because of the use that the building was going to have. It was much more practical in stone. Okay. A great building on Main Street, the Eloy Lecomte building. Eloy Lecomte was a fairly new resident of St. Genevieve in the early 1800s. He was a guy who held several different posts. He was the county collector, a county judge, the probate judge, several other, the sheriff of St. Genevieve County. He built this great two-story stone building across here. This photograph on the next slide will give you a much better idea of how impressive that building was. You can see it had a beautiful two-story porch off the front with the dormers up in the roof line, and you can even see a third story there with two windows on that gable end. And I know Mark's familiar with this house because Mark used to live there. But to me, this is a magnificent building. You see, again, some of the stonework here. This is field dress stone, but look at how nicely done the jack arch is above the windows. So this was done by a mason who had some training and knew what he was doing as well. Okay. Just down from that is another building that Eloy Lecomte had some business with. He built this stone mill building in 1865, and it became a cone mill. So as technology evolved, they were not building grist mills driven by water power anymore. This building was intended to be a cone roller mill that would process the flour that way, and they had steam engines and boilers and all those things to run the machinery then. You can see from the map here that the building was lots bigger. A brick section here, but then a frame section was built out, would be on this side of that building today. As I talked to my mom last night, she said, well, what happened to the mill? Well, there were several explosions at the mill, and mills could be dangerous places because of the dust that got created, could have a tendency to explode. And obviously that's what happened here, and it was rebuilt several times. The stone building actually was 5 stories high. And if you look real carefully in the stonework right up in here, the photograph's not real obvious right here, but right there, and right in there are the windows from that level of the floor that had been closed in when the building was reduced. And today, just those 3 walls are what exist of the stone mill from 1865. Okay. Another sweet little stone house that doesn't get any airtime here in St. Genevieve is just up on 3rd Street. This is the Jean-Baptiste Burke house. It's still a cute little residential house, not a real large-scale building, 1 story, but it's in a nice setting, and it's survived in remarkably same condition. There have been some additions across the back, and I think a dormer added in the roof of the front facade, but it's really remarkably intact for a great little stone building. And according to what I've read, I don't know that there's any much more detail, it's a very early 1805 building, so that's really one of the earliest ones that we've seen. Okay, now we get to the house that has a lot of airtime because it's so monumental. The residents of St. Genevieve got together in 1807, and maybe even earlier than that, and made pledges to this organization to create the Louisiana Academy, to create a school for higher education that would be open to everyone. They accomplished that task by taking donations down to the smallest amount up to several hundreds of dollars at that point from the citizens here. And it's interesting to read the donation list because it wasn't just French people, it wasn't just American people, it was both of those communities coming together to create this task. So the trustees of the Louisiana Academy were tasked with creating this school. So the first thing they did was to acquire the site of the building, which of course you all know where that is, up on the school hill. But they then did a study and decided what kind of a building to build. We can go to the next one, please. Oh no, I thought I had another one. Let's go back. So they built a beautiful two-story building that measures 50 by 25. We're going to talk a little more detail about it at a later slide, I realize now. But finely done limestone, and they contracted with a gentleman to do the construction, William Shannon. But it's a classical style of architecture that you see in this building. Okay, thank you. And now another building that we're all familiar with, and Frank and Shirley Meyer's house, beautifully preserved and restored on North Main Street. Wonderful structure with the stone facade, so this about a 4-inch thick facade of these finely dressed stones, that honey-colored limestone. And you can see the house has undergone changes through the years. So the Habs drawing shows the big porch across the front of the house. And in the next slide, we're going to see the great two-story porch that was across the back of the house as well. So this house faced out over the Mississippi River. Frank believes now that the house had, Josiah Millard had another intention for the house, perhaps as some kind of an inn at some point. And so he had troubles, financial troubles, and things didn't work out the way he intended. So the house really became a private residence and eventually was the residence for one of Jean-Baptiste Vallet's sons, Francois Baptiste Vallet. So it's had quite a history. I have intimate recollections of the house in the flood of 1993 when the wheelbarrows were going down through the beautiful hallway, hauling sandbags out to the front. And believe me, the house held on by the slimmest of slim margins. But it's a delight that the house is here, and we owe a lot to Frank and Shirley Myers for their beautiful preservation of the house, and it's a national treasure, I think. Okay. And you drive by this wall all the time, too, without thinking about it. Of course, the Green Tree Tavern, Francois Jany entered into an agreement to have this wall built. From 1803. So this retaining wall you see out in front of the house has had restoration work done and changes done, but this is the wall that was built from 1803. Go ahead. And another house that we don't have with us today, and it's a very unusual house, about 1858. If you're all familiar with St. Genevieve, if you take Washington Street up and you just keep taking Washington Street up and up, finally it changes to Maple Street. This house was at the end of Maple Street. And I talked to Dave Weber in the recorder's office the other day. He said, oh yeah, I remember it. He said my parents would take us right by there every Halloween because it was called the haunted house. It was a spooky place, a ramshackle place. And he said, you know, we thought if we weren't good, they would just drop us off there. Captain St. Jem was from the Beauvais St. Jem family, St. Jem Beauvais family here. I forget exactly what year he was born, but he was kind of at the highlight of his career about this time. The house has had a few changes, additions across the front, but it was quite a magnificent building. I didn't include all the Habs photos of it, but you could have a whole program just on that house. It really had an unusual design. The windows were not standard windows as we know them. They were kind of, someone said it was designed to look like a chateau, and it did. It was quite a building. The interior photographs are remarkable of this. Unfortunately, it did not survive as well, and I know Bob's looked into it a little, but it's a remarkable stone building that was here. Go ahead. Now, kind of the granddaddy of them all is a building that was out on 61, just at the point where St. Mary's Road comes into 61 going south. You turn left, just right in that area was this house, the Vital St. Jem Beauvais house, from 1799. So this is the oldest of the stone buildings that we know about, talk about. This house has been fascinating for a long time. I won't say it's not with us anymore because it still is with us, but it's not with us quite like this anymore. In 1991, the owners of the property had the intention of demolishing the house and dismantling it, and it would have been lost. Fortunately, Mrs. Jenks, Margaret Matthews Jenks, here in St. Genevieve, saw the importance of this house. She created a little committee of people who I was happy to be on, along with Frank Myers, who in 1991 undertook an amazing study of this house, documentation, everything that was necessary with the intent of saving this house. Maybe not on that site, but saving it for some future use. So I want you to all think about that because I think the time is coming that that house needs to see the light of day one more time. Frank studied the masonry. It was dismantled piece by piece. But what I want to tell you about the house today is my thought about this house is that some mason from Quebec was brought down here to St. Genevieve, maybe not for the specific project to build this house, but this house exhibits so many characteristics of French-Canadian, Quebecois masonry houses. You could plop it down in Quebec today and no one would take a second look because it's a dead ringer. So let's go through a few things that I can show you about the house. Here's from the 1930s. The house had gotten altered. You see the dormers now out of that roof system, but it sat up off the ground, so the front porch, the front level was ground level, but the first main level of the house was one story up because it sits on a slope. Okay. I talked to somebody earlier today about Croix de Saint-André, St. Andrew's Cross. We look at our truss systems in the vertical log houses today, and they all have a very similar look. This stone house had a truss as well, whether we call it a Norman truss or not, but it is in this pattern. This illustration comes from a book about rural architecture in Quebec. It's a dead ringer for what they have up there. So go ahead. Here's the truss system in that Vital Saint Jean Beauvais house with the St. Andrew's Cross. So instead of the kind of bracing system we have in the rest of the houses, it has a very specific kind of construction that was used in stone houses in Quebec. Thanks. Go ahead. Here's a drawing that was done for Frank's project, which shows those cross bracing systems in the system of the house, the roof system. And there's another. And I looked and looked and looked for these pictures, which I took one day when I went out there to document for posterity the house as it was being dismantled. And so that's where these photographs come from. The other thing that I think is marvelous is this little system of construction that was used in Canadian houses. And I can't remember the word because it's in there in French someplace. But Frank calls it a little outrigger, which I think is much easier to recognize. It's right here. That little piece of wood is actually attached at the top plate to the rafter. And here's what it does. This is the house with the roof coming down. It actually makes a slight dip out, and it brings the drip edge from the roof out away from the masonry wall. It keeps that water out away. And as time went on in Canada, you see the distance that outrigger came out just increase. So here's very early. Here is about the end of the 18th century, about the time the house was built. It's about this size. And later on in the middle of the 1900s, or 1800s, it gets to be a much wider outrigger. But what I find interesting is this roof on this house is 45 degrees in tilt, and that matches up with the center one, or excuse me, it matches up with the mid-1800s version, but the outrigger matches up very much with this one. I think what had happened here was what they discovered on the vertical log buildings. The very steeply pitched roof was necessary for a Canadian winter. Here in the mid-Mississippi River Valley, the steep pitch was not so necessary, so it comes down. So that's what happened here. I think it's a blending of the two. Okay. Great building. Another part of the construction is this top plate that rides on top of the stone structure. Go ahead. And you can see the cross section here, right here, and one more. And here it is on the building itself. So there's that heavy stone timber. The rafters actually sit down on top of that stone timber. Instead of going into the masonry, they all go into that stone timber. One more. And this is one of the progressions in the way the buildings were built in French Canada as well. They started out with 2 of those plates on the earliest buildings. Then there's a slight change, and then it gets down to 1. And so we're in about the third, thanks, Bob. We're in about the third phase of the evolution of those Canadian buildings. But those phases coincide with the time, match the time that building was built here with what was going on in French Canada at the same time. So a guy didn't come here and build a house that had been built in Canada 50 years earlier. He was probably building a fairly contemporary stone building matching what was going on in Canada. I find that really remarkable. Okay. I want to show you kind of groupings of these houses. And for historians, we want to look at things like similarities. So these are all the houses that are in that group that I think were dedicated probably to mostly residential use. So you see there are both 2-story buildings, 1-story buildings, in kind of a mix of those things. So there's no real standardization in that. But next. These are all buildings that had both mixed use, commercial and residential, and they all follow that pattern of the 2 double entranceways, which I think is a telling thing that these buildings were both used for both purposes. And next, these are buildings that were either religious or educational, monumental size. The church was a huge building. Those 2 beautiful 2-story stone buildings were really important buildings. They were semi-public buildings, and so they set off an air by using stone and by using a 2-story building. Here's just buildings that are commercial. They run the gamut from probably the earliest, which I think would have been the Pratt warehouses, to the 2 very similar buildings that were built by Albert Busch and Kyle Busch and Roberts, then down to a mill building, another commercial kind of a building. Oh, there's a little warning sign, Bob, that means I'm talking too long. Well, the next group are buildings that were for strictly a specific use, like a kitchen building or a stone building. I did want to take a little time and talk about what we know that matches up from the archives. We've looked at the buildings. Those are the physical structures. But in St. Genevieve, we're lucky that we have information from archives to match up with the real thing. And the archives show and tell us a lot about the buildings as well. First is a great contract. It's written in French, and you got to hand it to Jacob Philipson, who was German. He was literate in French as well. His contract was with Julien Ratte, a French guy here in St. Genevieve. You related to him?
My 4th great-grandfather.
All right. He had a contract with Philipson to supply the stone for his house. And I have some excerpts of the text in French from the account. And their contract was, I think, in the middle of June in 1818 for the stone. Then there was another contract between Michael and Sebastian Butchers, those 2 German stonemasons, and Jacob Philipson, who he had contracted with to build the house that you saw on Merchant Street, a 1-story commercial building. So they both had contracts with Philipson. So what happens when you have a contract? You usually get into another argument. So the reason we know those contracts, because building contracts are a rare thing in the archives, is that both Ratte and the Butcher brothers sued Jacob Philipson in 1820. They could not agree on the price of the building. That's okay. So they disagreed on the price, and the price that the Butcher brothers wanted was an exorbitant amount. They said Philipson owed them $4,000 for the construction of that building. He paid $1,500 for the lot. He sold the house and lot for $3,500. So if you paid him $4,000, he was in big trouble. So if you're in a lawsuit today, what do you normally do? You call in your expert witness, right? So they called in an expert witness from Illinois, who was a stonemason over there, Miles Hotchkiss. And they did a deposition with Miles Hotchkiss to ask him questions about the contract and he came over to St. Genevieve to measure the building. Masons have a unit of measure called a perch. It's 16 and a half feet long by 1 foot high by 1 foot deep. And so the idea is we got paid, the Butcher brothers got paid 75 cents per perch, but they couldn't agree on how many perches were in the building. So Hotchkiss came over and gave his idea of how many perches, and they had their idea. They fought it out. But in that document, the deposition, it gives us another clue. Hotchkiss says, yes, I was over in St. Genevieve previously, and I measured the Jean-Baptiste Huberdeau house for the two Masons as well. So now we not only know that those guys built the Philipson Valet house, they also built the Huberdeau house. So those little tidbits kind of start to fill in the gaps. We have another merchant who is an Irishman, Patrick McManus, who's listed on that same jury list from 1812 as a Mason. We also have wondering about William Shannon himself, whether he just did the contract and was kind of the general contractor for the building. I suspect that he was not the Mason because he was educated at St. Mary's College. He was an entrepreneur involved in a lot of different projects and commerce and trade. I just don't have the sense that he was a Mason. I could be wrong, but I think we need to be able to do more research into the archives to just kind of prove that one way or the other. Are we going to do finger puppets for the rest? I wanted to show you a couple different windows side by side. You can really see the techniques used in the Huberdeau house and the Felix Valley house are very much the same. I think that's our best bet for trying to identify the Masons on some of the rest of the projects. A couple of them, the two-story buildings, the Eloy LeCompte and the old Academy are similar in style. Their Academy's larger, that's 50 by 25. But then there are slight differences in the masonry that just don't seem to add up. So it's a story that is still unfolding, and I've gotten really interested, as you can tell, in kind of trying to piece things together for this. It's kind of the other side of St. Genevieve's history. So I want to keep you, all up to speed, and I think please keep that beautiful 1799 French-Canadian Vital Beauvais house, St. Jean Beauvais house, in the back of your mind, because I think St. Genevieve is ripe to try and put that house back together. And I think it would be a wonderful project because it's a beautiful part of that Canadian history that we have here too. So we'll end on that note since Bob's turned me off. We'll call it. No, we're good. We need a break. Thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it. Hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you. Yes. Pardon me? Are you going to do a book? Am I going to do a book? Oh, gosh. I don't know.